The appearance of Kiyi in the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics, Zuko's younger half-sister, marks a kind of renewal for him. He reunites with his mother and his perfectly normal and cute new younger sister. And yet, there is something fundamentally unsatisfying about the appearance of Kiyi. Not that there's anything wrong with the character herself, but that her presence represents to Azula the fear of being replaced, of simply being pushed to the side in favor of the ideal younger sister, the one she never was. And Azula is not wrong to feel this way. I don't think any of us can truly object to Zuko for liking the opportunity to have an adorable baby sister, nor can we object to Ursa for starting over with a new family after everything she endured, after losing much of her memory, and really having to start a whole other life. And yet, the dissatisfaction of Azula at this harmonious, perfect order represents the tension that Avatar: The Last Airbender deals with regarding the distance between these perfect, idyllic endings regarding and promoting the triumph of goodness and justice, and the more jagged and uneven reality beneath the glistening facade of a new age, a better age, a more just age, are all of the now misplaced pieces of the old order. And those pieces do not merely crumble, they do not disintegrate, they cannot merely be ignored. There are elements of that old order, such as Ozai, that people really want to be gone. Zuko has slightly more ambivalent feelings about Ozai, considering that Zuko does not know how to rule, and he asks Ozai for advice in the promise. This is perhaps not the perfect idea, but he needs solutions from someone who is experienced, from someone who understands the harsh, callous reality of being a world leader. It's not a pretty, prim job. Ultimately, Zuko cannot rely on Ozai's advice, though, and he must forge his own way, his own path, a path that is neither too overly idealistic or too cynical and dark and Hobbesian. Ozai is a part of the old order that someone like Zuko, the bringer of the new, wants to discard, even though doing so is difficult. Azula is a little bit different. The question as to why Azula is not the same as Ozai in terms of just being this dark, mystically corrosive emblem of a militaristic and cruel order is complicated. a lot of people will point to Azula's age. She was only 14 during the events of Avatar: The Last Airbender. She is not an adult like Ozai. And I think that's true. I do think she's very young, even if she would never think of herself that way. And her complete unsettled adolescent self is always lurking there beneath the surface of the image of Azula as this hyper-competent, hyper-professional, almost coldly precise individual. And yet, I think there's more to it than that. She's a victim of her circumstances, sure. Arguably, Ozai is as well. He was forced by his father, Fire Lord Sozin, to kill Zuko. Now, I'm not saying we should feel sorry for Ozai necessarily, but the rot in this imperial system goes far beyond him. And yet, he is framed by the show far more negatively than it frames Azula. Part of that is because of his age, but part of it is also that Ozai has so fully committed himself to this ideology of power and domination. He has no other sides to him. He has turned himself into a one-dimensional villain. He has fully committed himself to this corrosive ideology. Azula is a bit different. Azula, yes, is capable of being selfish, manipulative, and cruel. She has no desire to abandon her arrogance, her egotism, her desire to view herself as this emblem of Fire Nation power and majesty. She views herself as having the divine right to rule, as she says to Long Fang in episode 220, The Crossroads of Destiny. And yet, we know that she's more than that. She complicates the image of her as this stereotypical, narrow character. We know that she cares deeply what others think of her, at least in certain contexts. The beach does a lot to humanize Azula. The ending of the show, in which Azula sees her mental state completely unravel, and by the end, she is weeping and wailing in an animalistic, feral way, is tragic. And the only reason that ending registers as tragic, truly tragic, and not merely unfortunate, is that we know the person Azula can be. A limited person, a solipsistic person to an extent, but nonetheless a person capable of a wider range of feelings and experiences than Ozai appears capable of. She feels genuinely isolated from those around her, to the extent that she can't even fit in with normal teenagers on a beach day. That isolation grips her, and she knows that she can manipulate people to get what she wants, as we see even with Chan in The Beach, where she puts on the image of this ditzy, rather silly teenage girl to attract his attention, and yet she doesn't want to have to do that. She wants to be able to connect with people without manipulation. And she does demonstrate a flicker of concern for Zuko, which Ozai never does. So, Azula is not this allegorical symbol of badness, of the pure vileness of the Fire Nation that should be excluded and banished. The end of Avatar is the triumph of goodness and virtue, but there is an innate problem with those moral terms, as much as they offer as an alternative to the rather extremist, violent ethos of the Fire Nation. They are terms that create these rigid separations. There is the good and the bad. There is the just and the unjust. There is the virtuous and the callous and cruel. And the bringing of justice and goodness to the Fire Nation carries with it the assumption that there can be this clean and neat division between the so-called good people, who are worthy of being invited into this prosperous, vibrant new Fire Nation, and the bad people, who should be thrown in prison like Ozai, or otherwise banished from their positions and from any kind of authority, and thus morally censured. But people are not allegories. Under an allegorical framework like, say, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, there can be a clear hero who is not just a good person, but a symbolic, allegorical manifestation of goodness. And as he journeys toward, for him, it's Christian virtue, and finally entrance into heaven, but different allegories for different cultures can swap out the specific qualities and religious significances of the allegory, but the basic structure of the allegory remains that people can be reduced to these symbols, to these abstract significances. Bunyan's pilgrim journeys through a world where people are literally named for a specific type or a specific category. And Bunyan's pilgrim journeys through places such as Vanity Fair. That is exactly what it sounds. It is a fair, this carnival-like atmosphere filled with vanities, these superficial, alluring temptations that appeal to the ego. Bunyan's pilgrim must escape these temptations, must cast them aside as reprehensible, and ascend toward the good and the just. There's nothing wrong with allegories, but there is a problem in attempting to apply a merely allegorical framework to a world of flawed and imperfect people. What do you do with someone like Azula in that framework? Do you cast her out as being one of the bad ones? Even though she has demonstrated that she is not this simplistic, reductive character. She's not this mere emblem of villainy. And she is still Zuko's sister. And Zuko knows that. And he knows that she's not this simple baddie who does nothing but lie. Yes, she is far from a model of virtue, and she is far from the person even that he was at the start of the show, when he was, yes, misguided, but he had good impulses. It's easier, at least, to invite Zuko into the world of the good and the just. For someone like Azula, it's much more difficult. But does that mean she should merely be cast out? That she should merely be, in a sense, replaced with a new, better, younger sister for Zuko? In Dostoevsky's brilliant masterwork, The Brothers Karamazov, there is this haunting chapter about the Grand Inquisitor. That's probably the most famous part of the book. And the views of the Grand Inquisitor are not Dostoevsky's views, but they are views that Dostoevsky clearly feels troubled by. And the Grand Inquisitor's not merely a callous, vile person, although he is to a certain extent. He imprisons Jesus for messing with and distorting the rather authoritarian precepts of the Catholic Church during the Spanish Inquisition. And yet, the Inquisitor has a point. He makes the argument that, why, Jesus, did you not exert worldly power? Why did you not give people a material incentive to be good and just? The counter-argument, of course, is that you become just for its own sake, not for any material reward, not for any worldly prize, but because virtue in of itself will lead the truly moral to their ultimate state of inner spiritual peace and tranquility, and finally to heaven. And yet, the Grand Inquisitor is right that most people are not virtuous. They're not these emblems of justice and goodness. Does that mean that they should be left in the wilderness? That's the majority of people. Are you going to condemn them to this state of spiritual malaise and unease, excluded from this world of goodness? It's a compelling argument, I must say, and it's one I think of quite a lot when I think about Azula. Azula is not a good person, of course, and she's not even merely flawed and imperfect in the same way that Zuko is. Does that thus mean that Azula should be excluded, like she clearly feels? Ultimately, the comic seems to suggest no. She is Zuko's sister, as much as, or judged purely by blood and experience, more than Kiyi. She is as much Ursa's daughter as Kiyi. Someone like Azula can't merely be excluded. One can't merely pretend that she doesn't exist while building this ideal, gleaming, beautiful new world. People like Azula, imperfect, often grotesque people, but people who are nonetheless far more complicated than a pure villain like Ozai, need to be considered regarding what their place is in this new world. To what extent can Azula be included into the family, and thus, in a symbolic sense, included into the new Fire Nation? It's a difficult question, but the solution, the answer, is not to simply exclude her because she is not good enough or pure enough. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. Tune in soon for next analysis. We'll be coming soon. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.